In this video, I'm going to write a recursive function in JavaScript and at the same time manipulate the content on a web page. You can follow along with this video, so it's best to watch on a desktop computer where you can place the video on the left and write code on the right. Open any browser as you've already done and navigate to the video page that you're currently on and start watching this video. Recursion works in JavaScript and it actually works in reality too. Right-click the page and select Inspect. An overlay pops up. Click the three dots in the top right to pop out the overlay so we can snap it to the right half of the screen. There's two tabs in this window that we'll use, Inspector and Console. Inspector lets us view the HTML source of the page. When we hover a line on the right, the corresponding element on the page highlights. This works in reverse too. We click the icon button in the top left of the inspector, and we can now hover elements on the page itself and click on them to reveal their location in the HTML source. The HTML source for the description box is here. It has an ID of description. We'll use that ID to get a reference to the element in JavaScript. Switch to the console tab where we can start writing JS code. There's warnings and stuff from the page, so we press the garbage in the top left to erase them. The font is small and I forgot to zoom when recording, so I'll zoom in now for the important parts. The first thing I'm doing here is writing the line that gets a reference to the description box. The document object refers to the entire web page. Query selector takes an ID or a class as an argument and returns a reference to that element in code. I type in description and I add a hashtag, which is the syntax for specifying that this is an ID. I'd add a period instead if the word description was a class. It appears that there's more than one description element on the page. The box should light up when I complete this line, but it doesn't, so I'll switch to query selector all, which returns an array of results rather than just the first element that's encountered. Let's see if it's index 1. The box lights up when I complete the line, so here we have our reference. Save that reference to a variable DESC for description for later use. Next, let's set the content of the description box to nothing. It disappears now because it has 0 height and 0 width. So I explicitly set the height and width to 806 and 600. This blank space will be used as the output area for our program. Now we write our first function. This will be a recursive function. The argument it takes is a parent element, which on the first call will be the description box itself, then recursively smaller boxes until some minimum size. Get the size of the parent with this bounding box function that returns width and height. Use the special unwrapping JS syntax to get and rename the width and the height parameters. The if statement will ensure that we won't recurse any deeper if the parent box is smaller than 20 units of area. Otherwise, we would recurse until the program crashed. Inside the if statement, we create a div element with document.createElement and assign the width and height to be half that of the parent. Let's run this code now and observe that there are many invisible divs nested inside the description box. Next, I'll attempt to color these divs so we can see them. I refresh my browser tab to get rid of the divs, but it's actually easier to just assign the empty string to the inner HTML property of the description box instead. Since I refreshed, I'll need to set the description box width and height again. I create a random number. Math.random returns 0 to 0.9 repeated. I multiply by 3 and floor to return 0, 1, or 2 randomly. This lets me assign a red, green, or blue color to the nested divs as they are generated. I set the opacity as well, hoping that this will create a cascading effect and allow us to see all the other divs at once. For whatever reason, that just didn't look right. The colors were muted since they were semi-translucent on a black background, and the opacity wasn't stacking as I intended. I think when divs are nested, the opacity on the parent sets the opacity of all the contents equally. If the divs were stacked on top of each other instead of nested, that would probably look more interesting. But I have a different idea that should look better than this anyways. For my new idea, I'll get a color palette. This site is good, but I want more than 4 colors. Here is a good set of colors. To copy them, I could probably use the export button, but instead I copy them all by hand, one at a time. I could also write a script that reads them from the page using document query selector to read the value, but I decided to just copy them. I save them to an array called color, and I write a function to pull a random color or hex string from the color array. Now I return to my createBox function, and I remove the color code. I write two for loops. The outer loop sets x to 0 and 1, and the inner loop does the same for y. The code that I place inside the two loops will be executed 4 times, with all x-y combinations where x and y take the values 0 and 1. I'm going to use this to create 4 nested divs inside of every div. Each child div will take up 1 quadrant of the outer div. So instead of before, where only one corner of the description box had nested divs, it's going to be all 4 corners, and the colors should look nicer. I need to set the position of all child divs to absolute, so I can use the top and left properties to position them. The description box itself will be set to relative, so that it will stay in the same place on the page, but allow absolutely positioned elements inside to correctly be positioned. Time for the first test. I set the position of the description container to relative, and before I call the function, I reset the contents of the description box. This isn't what I expect. Let's take a look and see why only one corner has divs. My mistake is that for each outer function call, I need to append 4 children and make 4 nested calls, so I move those lines into the loop. Let's reset and try again. I use the up arrow to recall previous commands instead of retyping them. The code takes a long time to run, and the page seems a little unresponsive. That means a lot of div elements are getting created. Recursive functions need a base condition, or else they'll just run forever. But I'm confident in this case that my size check, if statement works, because the code terminated when I ran it before. The code finishes, but we only have divs in the right lower corner. Looking at the code, I see that I'm only creating 1 div element per function call when I should be creating 4. So let's move all logic into the loop and try again. Once again, it takes a while to run. And the final result surprises me. It's not what I expected, but when I think about it, it actually does make sense.